Okay, hello and welcome. Today's experiment is going to be involving putting acrylic pour painting onto pieces of regular paper. What I've been doing is trying to see if there's a way where I can get the acrylic paint to stick to the paper without causing these warp lines that you see here running up and down in the middle. When you pour on paper, the water parts of it will leak through the paper around the sides and kind of warp it. You can see these little veins along the back where the paint has gotten underneath the paper. These two pieces here were ordinary printer paper, just plain white paper. And I tried a larger piece of artist sketchbook paper, which is a little thicker and archival quality, meaning it has a better quality to the paper, in addition to certain acid standards that don't affect the acrylic paint very much. But none of these have been so successful. So what I'm doing in this round of experiments, I have, again, this higher quality artist's sketchpad paper, which I've cut in half. This paper I've sealed around the edges with frog tape. It's a masking tape that I find has better paint sealing capabilities than standard blue masking tape. And this other half of the sketchpad paper is going to be covered in water. The reason I'm doing these two experiments, I think that by adding the frog tape around the edges, it might prevent paint from leaking around the corners and coming back underneath the paper, which might warp it and cause those lines. Or this one, if I wet the paper first and force it to warp, then I can come in with a tool like old credit card or a bone spreader and flatten it again, thereby reducing the warping that it's already undergone. We'll find out what happens with that. And I also have a napkin that I've torn in half here, just because I had one lying around. We'll see how it goes. Above all, the reason I want to see if we can pour acrylic paint on paper is because we'll be able to apply these poured paintings onto other surfaces better, because the paint will soak into the paper. It's porous, so the paint will go into the paper and remain there permanently. And then on the other side of the paper, we'll still have a porous surface that we can use to glue onto other things, like maybe the inside of one of those transparent coffee mugs, or over a lunchbox, something you keep on your office desk at work. There's a lot of different places you can decorate that you may not be able to pour paint directly on top of. So let's see if we can figure out a way to get this paint to stick onto a paper without warping. Okay, we're back. I have wet this paper ahead of time using a paper towel. Once I had the paper completely covered in water, I used the paper towel to press the water further into the paper and ensure it was soaked in, and then gently pulled down with firm, uniform strokes. Be careful you don't overwork the paper. Lucky with this artist sketch paper, it's a little thicker so it doesn't tear so easily, but it still did begin to tear even with just gentle pulling because of the oversaturation of water into the paper. So if this water method works out and you want to give it a try at home, just be careful. Don't overwork the paper or you'll tear it up and you'll probably have to start over, and it's messy. Why bother, right? Then in the middle we have the masking tape and we have the napkin untreated because it's a napkin, who cares, right? If none of these work and we still get these wavy textures, I want to call out that they're not bad. These are some interesting looks, but with the warping of the paper, as the paper warps, it bunches up like this, right? The paper gets these bumps in it, and that causes the paint to sink over the bumps and it changes the surface. So you'll end up with different shapes and paint patterns than you may be familiar with because of the warping. So let's see if we can't find a way to keep the surface flat so that we can get the same familiar pour painting results that we know and enjoy. I've mixed the paint ahead of time. I have white, then red, then neon pink, finally black at the top, and I'm going to be doing a dirty pour onto these surfaces here. Let's take a look at that now, sped up to save everybody's time. we have some interesting findings right off the bat. First of all, the wet paper does not appear to have warped at all. By this point, it would have definitely begun to show warping, because the middle paper, which has been taped off, is bowing up, becoming concave, curved at the ends here along the edges of the tape, which is forcing the rest of the paper to flow into the center. It's nice because it helped cover the rest of the canvas, and we're seeing more vertical warping than the horizontal warping. Overall, we're not seeing a lot of warping in the center of this, which is for the best because we can always trim off the edges with some scissors if we don't like the texture that shows up there. But as long as we have a nice flat surface where the majority of the paper has not been warped, we can keep some interesting designs that'll resemble pretty much what you see here at this moment. The napkins is also a bit of surprise. These have not warped at all, and as a matter of fact, the little creases from where the napkins came pre-folded have also sunk down, making a flat uniform surface without having to try. I didn't have to tape it or wet it like I had to do with this other paper. I imagined it would work this way because the weight of the paint itself I expected to be a little heavier than the light surface of the napkins, which would just press it down, and gravity alone would push down on the napkins harder than the motion of the cells. We're talking the actual paper itself, the chemical composition, would be able to absorb the liquids. So that is to say, the paint is heavier than the napkin can pull things up. It means it stays flat. If either of the two paint surfaces refuse to stay flat, but the napkins do, well, that's a nice handy little cheap way that we'll be able to spruce up our decorations. So this is going to be it for the moment. I'm going to let these sit overnight. We'll come back to it in the morning and see how this turned out. Alright, we've had sufficient time to dry, and now let's take a look at how some of this peels off the paper, as well as the results of if it warped or not. First, we'll start with the napkins and work our way up towards the more prepared papers. I'm going to scoot this to the side so we can see it a little better. So for the napkins, I did get a little too eager to peel some of it off, and you can see here the napkin was soaked all the way through by the paint, which means this is not going to be very effective for this style. It would be more effective to simply put the paint onto some wax paper or silicone, placemat, or freezer paper, something non-porous, which we'll talk about in a minute. Something that the paint won't stick to and that you can just peel off later without the extra step, because it didn't do the napkin any favors. That being said, let's try peeling it anyways. I've cut some of these paint ahead of time so that we can try peeling just by itself, and if it gives us resistance and it starts to tear, then we can come in with little safety razor, disposable razor, and try and help gently guide it. You can also use a credit card or any flat surface. So let's give this a shot. I'm going to try from the left side here. Or is that your right side? So it seems to have come off just fine, and you can see again that it's completely paint underneath. The napkin soaked all the way through with the paint, none of it. There was no barrier, so the paint is completely on both sides of the napkin now. It's paint with a napkin sandwich. We'll just peel the rest of it off here, pointing out that cut I told you I made a little earlier. And also note, let me try and get a close-up here. I'm going to pause 1 second so I can focus. Okay, so notice how there's all these little wiggles and wrinkles, all these warping on top of the surface of the napkin, as well as underneath it here. You can really see it there underneath. That's all spots where the paint decided it was going to force the napkin to take a different shape due to the liquid volume, all that physics stuff. Long story short, paper, when it gets wet, it warps. Pretty much any plant-based things, cloth, wood, things like that, they all warp when they get wet. So the napkin I can flatten out again either by doing an iron and then put another protective surface on top of it. Don't iron directly on paint, that's a bad idea. But I can add something else like a protective layer of cloth and iron through that, or I can use my heat gun. You can use a hair dryer, would probably be hot enough to do the trick for something as thin as this, and smooth it out again. But based on the results, I don't see any benefit to doing it through a napkin. Just do it directly on the surface and you'll get this nice pattern just as an acrylic skin that you can peel off. I'm going to come out of focus again so we can look at what's on the desk. Okay, so we'll peel off the other half of the napkin. This particular napkin I tried folding in half first, but it has the exact same results as the napkin we just peeled. It has the same warping and wrinkling on it. Both sides the paint went all the way through, so we have paint with a napkin in the middle. Totally useless in terms of technique. You would just be better off putting the paint on something non-porous and doing an acrylic skin. Next up, let's look at our thicker sketchbook paper, which we tried to seal off with masking tape to prevent warping, you know, to hold the paint down in shape and to prevent paint from seeping underneath, because even if we hold the edges down, if the paint's able to get underneath, then it can warp it from underneath, right? I'm going to peel some of this masking tape off to show you how the paint behaves as we peel it, i.e. if the paint will tear cleanly along the edge of the masking tape, or if it'll start ripping over the paper. Well, no, that was a small piece. I was going to say, wow, it ripped straight through the masking tape. That was a smaller piece of masking tape. We'll come at it from the other side. Okay. It is strangely sticking very well to the freezer paper underneath, but as for the artist paper itself, it did create a clean cut on the paint. I believe this side is next highest, so let's take a look at that. Again, the paint has kind of seeped through a little bit through the masking tape, and it's bonded to the freezer paper below, which is not something I've seen often in a masking tape or a freezer paper. That's pretty unusual results. As we get to this big puddle, I'm going to carefully take this tape off from the paper side, aiming towards the puddle, because now we can save the rest of that for this acrylic skin. Let's go ahead and peel that off right now. Got the freezer paper, trying not to make a mess out of that, my phone's going off, and I ripped the paper, so let's do this a little more gently, shall we? Okay. This is also one of the reasons I wanted to test creating acrylic skins using paper versus using paint directly on a non-porous surface, is because the skins can be pretty delicate. So I was trying to see if we could give them a more reliable surface while retaining the shape and pattern we want. This tape is starting to tear both the paper below and the acrylic skin, so this is one of those times where I'm going to take my safety razor, well, just box cutter blade, this is a box cutter replacement blade, and I'm going to cut down the line. Again, always practice good safety. I'm going to cut away from myself so I don't accidentally slip and risk cutting myself, and I'm going to be very careful not to push hard or use excessive force on this. I don't want to risk slipping and cutting myself. Okay. Easy enough, right? Get rid of this extra tape and we'll finish peeling this acrylic skin. Ooh, that's satisfying. So this is acrylic plastic. Acrylic is a kind of plastic, and acrylic in paint will eventually dry to just this thin plastic layer once all the liquid content has evaporated and dried out of it. So this is what's considered an acrylic skin. A lot of artists will use this inside of jewelry, brooches and stuff, or just additional projects to help decorate, add some color. I'll set that off to the side and let's continue looking at this artist paper. I don't want to waste too much of your time, so I'm going to go at this a little quicker. There we go. Take the rest of that paint off, the rest of that tape. Beautiful. I love that frog tape. But you can see through the reflection of the light that this got warped pretty badly, even with the tape on it. And as a result, some of the edges have suffered stretching. Nothing too horrible in terms of the stretching, but let's see, where this part's raised, right? You can see this part is raised, and then around it, this ridge where my finger's at, the pattern is super muddy. Let me try and zoom in here. The pattern is super muddy. It just looks like some grayish pink. There's mess. It has no definition at all. Even though we kept an interesting look on the warped part, warping caused the surface of this to raise up, right? And as it raised up, the paint dribbled down and made this big puddle where it all sat there, and as it dried, it just kind of, it just turned gray and mushy. Nobody likes that. So, due to the warping, I'd say this isn't the best look we could have got, although I'm not terribly disappointed with the look. Again, being paper, I can use a protective layer and iron this out flat to remove the warping, or I can use a heat gun. The point is that acrylic is a plastic, and thin plastics can be reshaped with gentle heat. So the tension of the acrylic plastics would be enough to reform the shape of this paper should we apply heat to it through an iron or a heat gun. I'm going to focus again real quick. And now that we're focused, let's look at the last piece, which I am very happy with, which is the paper, the artist sketchbook paper that we've wet ahead of time. So again, having cut it in half, this actually started peeling off on its own when it dried. It did not warp at all when it was wet, thanks to pre-wetting it and smoothing out the warping. But as it dried, it had started to pull up the edge of the freezer paper it was dried on. It was trying to warp, but the tension of the acrylics as it was drying was enough to keep it solid and prevent that, which is great news because this was the end goal of the experiment. So we can consider this a success when you have paper, you wet it down ahead of time. You know what? We'll just do that. We'll do that in a second. I'll show you how we got that exactly. But we have both halves. I cut this initially because I wasn't sure if there was going to be any resistance on the paper, if it was going to start tearing, and also because I think this area of the paint is a lot more interesting than this area. I'll probably just toss this or something, we don't know. But let's take a look at this. Oh man, look at that little interesting color. It's got a nice sheen to it. The acrylics keep their brilliance. Even on the paper, it doesn't soak through too much. And we have a nice interesting design there. In a second, we're going to talk about porous versus non-porous. But first, let's look at this. This is the first in our line of experience that I would consider a true success. And on the back of this, which you can see here, we have a large area where the paint did not soak through. We have some at the edges, sure. It came back underneath as the paint was drying, which we can expect. We saw that with the previous results. But we have this huge area in the center that no paint soaked through, which means this is still paper underneath. This will be important, so let's talk about porous versus non-porous surfaces. Now, with my extremely impressive calligraphy and artistic illustrative skills, I've prepared some examples of porous and non-porous. Non-porous is usually the type of surface that pour painting is encouraged to be done over. A non-porous literally just means that it has no pores, it has no holes, so things cannot go through it. Things can't go the top side, and things can't go through the bottom side. It just doesn't let anything through. There's no holes. Whereas porous means that things can go through, they can go in, things can go out. It has holes, so there's a transfer possible through these surfaces. Non-porous is things like plastic. This acrylic sheet, this acrylic skin that we looked at earlier is non-porous. There are no holes in the plastic itself. Nothing goes through. If I put water on top, the water won't seep through the plastic and come out underneath. It will if I tear a hole in it, sure, but the plastic itself is non-porous. Nothing goes in or out. Things like paper are porous. We can see right here. Paint went through both sides. Paint went into it, and there's paint on the underside. You could do the same thing with the Sharpie. You could take a felt tip marker, you could take water, put it through paper, and eventually that stuff will go through the other side if you put enough onto the paper. Same with wood, same with cloth, like fabrics, denims, things like that. Things go through, it's porous. Touching back on what we said earlier, the reason a lot of pour painting artists will encourage you to work on a non-porous surface is so the paint that you're working with won't get stuck in something that it'll be impossible to take it out of later. You saw how easy it was to peel this paint off of the wax paper, which was non-porous. Because it was non-porous, they never got together, so they can just peel right off. They separate easily. I would pay good money to anybody that could separate the paint from off the surface of the paper. It can't be done because the paper is porous and the paint went through, and now that the paint has dried, they're bonded irreversibly. You can't take them apart. It's porous, and there was that transfer of material. This particular experiment does not aim to be a solution for how you do every pour painting. For the most part, you're going to work with non-porous surfaces because it's easier to clean up. You can peel the paint right off when you're done, and you don't have to worry about a mess that's going to be permanent. But for this particular experiment, I wanted to find out if there was a way that we could integrate paint into a porous surface that is not a canvas or other finished surface, because you can't do everything with acrylic skins. For example, let's say you want to decorate a notebook, or you want to insert an acrylic pour painting design into something else. Think about those little plastic binders that have the thin sleeves at front. If you tried to stick this in there, it's extremely flimsy and would probably just bunch up on itself, get all wrinkled and gross, and you could end up tearing it trying to pull it back out because the plastic and static electricity, it's a mess. Don't even get me started. This, on the non-porous surface, we were able to put the plastic into something that has a firmer texture. So you could totally slip this right into a binder. You could apply this to, maybe you have a mirror and you want to stick a little note inside. This has better rigidity. It's stiffer, so you can put it into a wider variety of whatever this is. I'm losing the words, but you get what I'm saying. That's one application. I haven't had as much time or as many resources to place these porous pour painting papers into a variety of objects, so I don't have as many examples to visually provide you, but this is a greater durability option than a simple acrylic skin, with the exception of specific jewelries and inserts designed to be covered up permanently with something like a resin or just a workable surface that you can just kind of set and forget this. The porous option allows you greater durability, greater flexibility, and most importantly, a greater application method. I'm gonna look at the back now, if you'll join me. Here we have the back side of a porous surface covered with paint, the back side of a non-porous surface, which is only paint. I can put glue on both of these and just kind of slap them onto something, right? But we talked about non-porous means nothing goes in, nothing goes out. So I can put glue on the back of this And not to go into much detail, but on a microscopic level, the glue might be able to hold the paint enough so that it doesn't just fall off. But you can still remove it because it's impossible for the glue to get a solid grip on a non-porous surface. That's just how it goes. You'll be able to peel it off, maybe with some damage to the acrylic skin. I'm not saying it'll still look pretty, but it's not as durable. On a porous surface, look at all this extra paper area that doesn't have paint soaked into it. That means all that extra area, glue can come up into the paper and it'll bond permanently the same way that the paint was bonded permanently to the paper on the opposite side. So, of all these applications, the most important reason we've worked with the porous side and that we've done these experiments is we now have a superior durability on acrylic skins by adding this paper using this method, and we also have greater versatility and longer lasting support if you were to glue this onto anything. The glue will adhere exponentially better. It's immeasurable, the difference between how well glue will stick to a non-porous surface versus a porous surface. Okay. I am going to recycle this little piece of paper since the video has now concluded its recording, and I'm going to show you that little technique we talked about for how to properly wet the surface to prepare it for an acrylic pour painting on paper. Inside this little Dixie cup I have maybe about halfway full of water. What I'm going to do is just carefully kind of set that onto the surface. You all know what water looks like and how it behaves, so let's pour that out. Okay, water's empty. It's already starting to lift and warp the paper. You can see that. And I'm going to take just a quick little card. This is an old AAA card because I got my replacement in the mail. And same as you would with any pour painting like we work with, I'm going to start spreading this out across the canvas. Hopefully you can see how it's warping, and you can hear as the card scrapes over it, the way it's cha-cha-cha-cha-cha. You can kind of hear it grumbling as it hits the ridges of the warped paper, my bad. Alright, this is completely covered in water. I probably used a little more than I need to, but the point here is to give you a thorough demonstration. Another good thing about this is that with the excess water you can really clearly see which parts of the paper have been soaked and which part is still absorbing water before it reaches that critical mass, before it's completely full of paper. Now, here's what I did to start. Pull the card down gently. This is starting to wrinkle, so I'm going to try and carefully help lift and pull it out to prevent tearing. I'm using enough pressure, barely enough pressure, so that it flattens out the air underneath, but it does not scrape at the paper because that leads to the tearing. I got that side done, but let's say you don't have a little plastic card or ruler, or you don't have a straight edge available at home. You can also just take the line of your thumb. You can see how this is straight, you can see how the edges are straight. There's still lots of flat parts in your disposal that you can utilize to help smooth the paper across. Your skin is actually going to be a little more rough on the surface of the paper than something like a plastic card would be. So still be careful you're not pressing too hard or tearing the paper. And just smooth that over until it's all set. I'm not trying to squeeze water out of the paper, because if this starts to dry, then when we put the paint on, it's going to warp back up again. It's totally useless. But I might even go and reintroduce some water to the surface. And believe it or not, this won't be too detrimental to the paint that we pour on. Most of this is going to continue being soaked through the paper, so just make sure you keep the surface moist until you're ready to actually add the paint, at which point you can kind of guide the excess off. Not scrape, not force, but just kind of guide the water off. That's the technique to properly wet your paper for this porous acrylic pour painting on paper. And with that, let me know what your results are if you give this a shot for yourself. Thanks for watching. So, let's talk about some of it in the comments. You know I love reading those. Give me some ideas on where you'd like to see an acrylic pour painting that you haven't been able to pour before. Maybe it's part of your cubicle at work. Maybe it's a coffee mug or a dish. Maybe you have more ideas than I do. Let me know in the comments where you think the application could be, and let's get a discussion going. Don't forget to join us on Reddit. Our community is growing every day and we'd love to see you there. And with that, thanks for watching.